Veena, thank you for coming again to Mumbai Local. We had a beautiful talk with Veena at Howrah Jilla, and we managed to catch her in her extreme busyness and drag her around to give this talk. So we're completely delighted to have you. Thank you.
Thanks, Samira. I think I'm going to mute the mic because I'm suffering with this sore throat. Is this working?
I don't think it's here. I think the mic is a little bit closer. One time.
Yeah, I think that.
Can you hear? Yeah.
So, I mean, thank you, because I think what Junoon primarily does is this kind of, the intersection between science, the arts, and to really create a platform where all of these cross-disciplinary streams come together, because that's really the need of the hour. We all in our own little worlds, but to really have a space where people from different fields come together and share ideas is something that I'm really interested in. And to really begin this culture of introducing the arts at a very early age, because all of us who arrived at taking up art as a profession really didn't understand what it meant to lead the life of an artist. And I think that a lot of us see it as a hobby, and it's hard to make that decision of taking it up as a profession. And I think that's something that the more we can get our kids to be exposed and to really go to museums, and that museum culture is something we need to try and do more.
And if I can interrupt for a second, one of the things that we are very interested in working with here is you lack the exactly this, that if you are somebody who is meant to be an artist, you don't think it's something you can do, and that's an issue. But also a big issue in India is you don't have the ring around the artist that you have in other countries. You don't have the people who know how to present, who know how to.
There is no support structure.
Very, very
I mean, we talk about all of those issues about the support for the arts, which is, as most of us know, we don't have institutional spaces here. And it has been primarily the private gallery scene that has really had a sustained platform for the arts. Can we bring down a few more lights, please, as we move into the slides? So I do have a lot of slides, and I think please feel free to interrupt at any point, but I will run through large bodies of work because it's almost been 2 decades of working, although these are works beginning from 2003, and the reason I thought we would begin, so you see a progression of how ideas develop, what form, and sort of the kind of return to certain preoccupations through different mediums continues to take place. Is that here, or do you want to turn this off? It would be nice to turn off some of that.
Then there will not be any light on.
That's okay. Do you guys just see it?
It's okay.
Plenty of light.
So
So I'll just quickly take you through the work, but do ask questions as and when you want to interrupt. And I mean, this is just beginning with like 2003, when I was invited to be part of an exhibition called Tiranga, which is of course the Indian tricolor, the national flag. And this is also a period in the city's history when I think we were all kind of rethinking our own belief of having grown in a very secular environment. And I think some of the debates that seem to be very relevant today were also something that preoccupied us back then, of who are the outsiders in the city, who really belong. I mean, this is post 2002, so we had already experienced the 92 riots, 2002 riots, and I was looking for a medium that would. So I began working out of archives over a period of time where each source of reference defined each body of work, and so the rubber stamp as a bureaucratic apparatus that both confirms as a symbol of authority and something that endorses, and was something that I began using. So what you saw earlier was this kind of a mock MOU. Sorry, it's like a mock MOU that was accompanied with the sculpture, and it had the preamble of the Constitution, which sort of course, holds out the promise of democracy and what it really meant. So it was trying to reflect back on what is it to be signed as a document, and had names of people representative from various regions in India sort of claiming ownership and sort of being included within this document. But from there, I hadn't then realized the potential of this medium as something that I would take ahead, but it formed several different bodies of work, and in this case, Penumbra was a cradle that is meant to, of course, comfort and support the human body, but here is like a pole-looking stainless steel cradle that actually rocks the form of the disputed territory, which is the POK, the Pakistan Occupied Kashmir, and the fate of these citizens almost like held in suspense, not really knowing which side they belong to. We have this light off, please. Can you please turn off this light?
Is that it?
This one, this one. And Synonyms was a whole body of work that I made between 2007 and 2009. And these were again out of names, out of official police records, where I was looking, through a friend who was looking for someone who'd gone missing. And to just think of this day and age when somebody slips out of the radar of communication, and the sense of anonymity of an individual in this sort of vast ocean of humanity, where names almost are reduced to statistics, was something I was struck by, and began working with portraits of migrants that lived in the neighborhood that I was photographing. So these form portraits of migrants, but they are made using names of people who are missing. And the kind of gaps of going up close and seeing the work sort of disintegrate, and as you step back, they sort of coalesce to form a complete picture. And I think somewhere that has also continued in my practice, where a unit in the whole is something that, or a fragment as part of the whole, is something that seems to recur. So these are the names. And they are meant to be freestanding portraits that you can view on either side. And this is at the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Arts. Yeah. So these are all rubber stamps which are first painted. So the way I work with these is that, so the names, like I said, are out of official records, but then they're in over 14 language scripts. And on a piece of plywood, I will first draw out the silhouette, lay out these pieces of wood, and after painting them like 3 coats, then transfer these onto plexiglass. So in that process of moving these from one surface to another, there are omissions and additions that also lend the portrait its final character. And then I place the names over it, and the backs and the handles. So this
Sorry,
is...
could you go back to the last?
Yeah.
So, where are they now?
So these are in the collection of the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Arts.
Okay. And they're standing there now?
I'm sorry?
They're exhibited now? Like
Not
today?
all the time, but they're in their collection, depending on what exhibitions they have. And
Okay.
so they show it maybe across with other artists from other parts of the world. That would depend on the thematics and who's curating the show that they have. But there were a series of them, and they're in different places. Some are in private collections, some are with me. And so this is, and like I mentioned that from there I really began working with archives, looking at how between 2008 to 10 I would keep visiting the Archaeological Survey of India archives, where I found that out of the 200 objects and sites that had gone missing, 35 were meant to be protected sites that the Archaeological Survey of India was answerable to the Indian Parliament about, and of which 12 were in Delhi. So I kept going to Delhi, looking in South Delhi, Nizamuddin and Mehrauli, and of course there are many other Mughal monument sites around there. But there were a lot of early 19th century paintings that I was looking at about certain Mughal monument sites, and the same sites I kept visiting and photographing. But this piece was, when I was invited to the Kennedy Center in Washington, I was thinking of several fragments, architectural fragments that could be shown, and eventually decided to work around this massive pillar, which is of course the foundation of all architecture. And that carried addresses of these monuments that have gone missing, but interspersed within these are phrases on architecture and ruins, besides poem fragments and yeah, so these are the lists of sites. And there are a series of, so a lot of times the material I've collected and which is part of the research process is not necessarily shared in that manner, because I mean, although I really enjoy that journey as an artist, but I always think that the final work should transform both materially in a way that also has a transformative experience for the viewer. And so a lot of the photographs that I made for those 2 years, I didn't quite know what I would do with that material. And finally I did a series of paintings which were based on sites that rub shoulders with new constructions. So there is this sort of pulls and pressures of rapid urbanization, builder lobbies, land grabbing on the one hand, but efforts at conservation, preservation on the other, and these kinds of tensions within certain sites that which have a sense of incompleteness, and yet it's not really a nostalgia for the past, but there is, I think there is a longing to go back to the sort of lingering sense of the past that continues to live within these sites, and what that tells us about the future of. So these paintings are
And
also.
this is also rubber stamps, right? The paintings.
So the paintings are on canvas, but they are made in such a way where parts of the painting are peeled. So the canvas is first fully covered with very fine sort of these, like almost like masking tape lines. And then after I paint on it, I remove those. So and there are parts of the painting that are painted separately on another canvas, which is cut out and pasted. So again, it kind of holds these friction of what is the painted surface and the pasted surface, and then the names and addresses are pasted over that. So they of course visually simulate the kind of rubber stamps that you get with the names. And so these are like stepwells in Delhi, in the heart of the city, which you actually just stumble upon. Delhi bus. That's it.
Where was that?
That's very close to my home. Rajon ki Baoli, and there is like this is in Khirki, so this is Khirki Mosque. And again, like you have these really very enclosed quarters, you have these new constructions. And for instance, Barakulla, which is this bridge that is now not as used because of several other bridges. But if you look at those early 19th century paintings and with all their inaccuracies, and today it's like a complete landfill with like, these are like photographs today. It's like a construction site, another highway bridge going over it. And wires that you find all over Delhi, I think you know these names, but the rubber stamp then takes on different forms in different works, and some of these are really sort of playful attempts at forming these barriers which are made with names of people people who've been denied visas to various countries. And we of course know that the denial of visas based on our own perceptions, based on class, nationality, gender, on how we perceive people. And so these are painted with flags of different countries without having a direct correlation between the name and the country it comes from. But a lot of the accompanying material with these are stories, because in this case I of course couldn't lay my hands on official records, as the consulates weren't willing to give out official information of those who've been denied visas. So these are primarily based on stories online, and which are of course in abundance from various places, whether it's Iraq, and a lot of them are denied to creative people, whether it's journalists, writers, sports people, from the music industry. And so those barricades were used sort of sometimes functionally within gallery spaces, where you could sort of demarcate spaces to go into, or sort of debarring entry-exit. And this kind of recurrent reference to the gate as a point of entry, and yet as something that sort of debars entry. In this case, these are, and what one is really trying to refer to are not necessarily physical borders themselves, but these sort of social barriers that exist. And in this case, it was these kind of misaligned gates, one from each side of the border, one half coming from the Indian side of the border and the other from the Pakistani side of the border. So they're sort of modeled on the gates at the Wagah-Atari border, where again I will make several visits to. And so while these gates are, they're sort of treated with sacred thread, which is of course in both Hindu rituals and in mosques, in Muslim mosques. You have these threads tied around trellis patterns, and usually meant to be untied when wishes are fulfilled, but here they seem to be completely swathed with thread, then forms roots. And a lot of the more recent work again stems from some of these early works where I was constantly alluding to these long shared histories, almost civilizational histories between these countries that are partitioned but continue to share their in this case borders, but here the roots allude both to, like I said, the shared past, but also in this case sort of debar your entry exit through the gates. The ends of the gates are made with a high voltage electric current, so there are these UV tubes and electric current, so like a fly zapper which makes a buzz sound every time an insect passes through.
That actually happens with the...
I'm sorry, yeah.
Cool.
And it's also how these works are seen in the larger context. So sometimes they just travel independently, but other times the other works that also refer to similar themes and ideas, but are made in either across time but also in different mediums. So this is Priest Crevice Contour, this photo piece with the bats, has this sort of changing, morphing line of control before the ceasefire line got frozen as the line of control between India and Pakistan in 1947-48. And the names are all of those who signed up a peace petition that was drafted in 2004, addressed to both General Pervez Musharraf and to the Indian Prime Minister then. And we had, and these were then stamped at the back of the body, almost treating the body like a document. And so these are the maps that it's based on, the form of the disputed territory. That seems to be changing. but several again references of because in a sense one sees these political divides that are so inherent today and that is really politically driven in a way, all these sort of the strained relationship between countries, between people. But it is in a sense a legacy of partition, and here the fact that these stamps are on the body also makes reference to that it was women and children, women who were raped and their bodies sort of claimed ownership to by being marked. There are several other associations to, this was a petition that was drafted in 2004, and names of those who signed up this petition were then what you see on that photo piece. And several other works I did around that time. There was a video which actually had names that appear in sand and get blown away, much like the peace process that keeps getting resurrected and has this optimism of renewal, but yet doesn't seem to be making any headway. And these allusions are to the body and land and rivers and veins in other works. This was part of a river biennial in Sydney where I was working around the river Indus and its tributaries where three flow into India, so Ravi, Satluj, Beej and Jhelum, Chenab and the river Indus into Pakistan, and how the sound that you sort of hear throughout in these urns is of the same river collected at various points, a river with multiple names. And you know that in the 60s there was the partitioning of the water, so often what is meant to be shared ends up being partitioned. And the trees that you see at the back have one half growing into the banyan and the other into the Devdar tree, both national trees of India and Pakistan, as again something that have common roots and then sort of bifurcate, but they are made with henna. And I was of course interested in our whole history with the Indus Valley civilization, so the usage of the terracotta pottery coming from there. And more increasingly I was thinking about these kind of natural resources that are shared, that each country claims ownership to, and yet they belong to neither. And that is something that I will come back to and speak about lastly in the more recent work. But I thought it was nice to put in this work so you see how the origin of some ideas happened maybe 5-6 years ago, and then they take on a completely different form later. This is a photo piece based on the quotation by Novalis, the German poet Novalis, in Our Bodies Are Haunted Rivers, and it's called Woven Veins. And like I said, these analogies between the body and land and rivers and veins is something that sort of plays out here, where not only are our bodies composed of water, nearly 80%, but also how civilizations grow around rivers and our own connections through rivers. Not only are they a means of trade or routes, but are also something that are used as boundary lines to define territory. This is a personal piece from 2007 called Walls of the Womb, which I made having come full circle with my own experience with motherhood, where I would keep going back to my early childhood, and having lost my mother at a very early age, I was kind of reminded of all the things she made me as a little girl, whether it was the stuffed toys, she would have a lot of hand embroidered dolls and all kinds of things that she made, but also her Indian sweets. So a lot of the recipes and the recipe books she left behind, amongst her personal belongings were saris that remained stacked for nearly 30 years in closed wardrobes, and I would sort of, as a child, bring them out, try them on, secretly put them back, and I sort of built my relationship around these simply to get to know her, not just through what I know about her through people, but also through old photographs and, like I said, her personal belongings. And there was a point when I wanted to reinforce these saris that were almost tearing, and yet I didn't want to bring them out in the public domain. And I decided to translate these handwritten recipe books that she left behind into Braille and cut silks, heavy silks, into the length of a sari to form these scrolls that were translations into Braille, which were made through the process of tie and dye, where each dot was first drawn, tied, and then dyed with craftspeople that I worked with in the northwestern region of Gujarat, in Kutch. And I worked with Khatri families to form these scrolls, which, like I said, were first translated from those books into Braille and then drawn by me on these white. So the virgin fabric is what you see as the white dots, and the rest of it is all dyed. In fact, this is a piece that has been shown extensively in several museums, has been shown at Milan, in Brazil, the National Museum in Korea. So this is from Sao Paulo, Saskia Pompeii, Saskia Belmzero, and Denmark. And it was with much trepidation and hesitation that I made this work, because it was, I've always sort of refrained from making anything around personal, and yet I was struck by how universal some of these experiences are, and that's something we could take on in the discussion of how things translate when they move across cultures. And these are some of the process shots, the making of the tiger. This is again to come back to some of the works. So I'm sort of leading you to works that I did now, more recently in 2013, but just to go a few steps behind to share these with you, because like I was showing you the barricades made using rubber stamps, once I began stringing these while they were with me in the studio, I was almost thinking about these, in this moment, like no other moment in human history, where the movement of people across countries exists, and yet there are far more regulations than ever before. And this kind of sense of global entanglements with these names of people who've been denied visas on these stamps that then come together to form a web, where the idea of a web as a home, and yet it's also a space of entrapment, and was something that then led me to make a large piece that was worked on more recently in 2013, where I was invited to propose a piece for the Bhavdaji Lal Museum, and it was a project that was initiated by the Zemia, the design group from Milan, where they had wanted to work with one artist from India, one from Brazil, and one from Turkey, to partner with a local institution in conceiving of a work for public space. And because public space, as you know, in Bombay, in a city like Mumbai, is so saturated with both sound and visual, that it was hard to find a space that was public enough and yet had gave you enough space for it to be a reflective place. And so the Bhavdaji Lal Museum was who they decided to partner with, and invited 20 artists to make a proposal. So I immediately wanted to allude to the history of this site, because it's a museum that really wasn't in public consciousness until its restoration some 8 years ago in 2008. And it is a small city museum that sort of archives the earliest moments of the city's history through old photographs, maps, and its own artisanal and industrial past. So it's got some beautiful objects that it has, but its own place in relationship to the city was something that I was more interested in, because the Bhadaji Lal Museum also had a change of name from being the Victoria and Albert Museum to being then called the Bhadaji Lal. And we know that the resonance of the name change runs across the city through not just the name of the city itself, Mumbai, but also through street names of Mumbai city that have changed from colonial names to indigenous names. And I really was thinking about what do names really mean to us, in what manner do these names reflect the identity of the city, of that we sort of move between these multiple identities of carrying multiple names, so the same site can be referred to by 3-4 names, and the old names often coexist with the newer names. And really how histories get stamped out of existence. And so this was a massive piece, as you can see, weighing over 1.5 tons, and just getting it up on the facade of the museum, because it is a heritage site with very, very few load-bearing points. We have to really bear that in mind. And so the making
Sorry,
of...
could you go back? Those are the names of the roads, right?
Yeah, so they're all the street names of Mumbai city that have changed. So like Queen Street, and did I show you the names? Has that here? That's right.
No.
So it's yet to come. And this is, right from the making of the work, through paper models, through like big blocks of wood, in which I then incise lines to then cast it into, like, each sculptural component was like a big rubber stamp, and then they were strung together. So they have like these metal pipes through which metal wires ran. And then one had to obviously make mock-ups to see how it would hang. And a lot about the volume, weight, the sculptural qualities of this piece were something that one had to work around.
Who did all the research and all? Must be a huge work to get the old names, right? How did you get that?
Well, yeah, now today you do find that people have already researched so much. So, of course, my research is built on existing research. It's not like I actually bring together that is existing. But yeah, it still takes a long duration of time to understand the material in hand and work with it. So and yeah, with 45 men and 8 police, we still couldn't get it up. So we were trying to sort of hoist the piece, and eventually we had to call the crane. So the whole building had to be scaffolded, and then there were workshops around this piece and the children. So yeah, these are the names. But it's a piece that is in the collection of the museum, and so Xenia really wanted this understanding with the museum to sort of bring out this piece over the decade at least a few times, to build a relationship with the city. And I was looking for an organic form, one that would sort of lend itself to the site itself, because the museum is in the premise of the zoo. And that obviously draws in a lot of people who come to the zoo. And now I'll just run you through some of the more like the outdoor pieces. So this was a piece that was in Korea, which was actually proposed for an outdoor site, and was meant to be at least 3 times the scale of this sculpture. And the text, as I conceived it to be, was to be grown in brass, and it's a text by Marcel Proust, which says a change in weather's sufficient to recreate the world and ourselves. And when, due to the weather changes, they had to move the sculpture indoors, I just thought it completely lost meaning to, because it was sort of trying to strike a relationship between the natural environment, and here was the sculpture having to be moved into the museum. And I had to think of another means or another medium to carry the text outdoors. So I was thinking of the Buddhist site, because this was up in the mountains in Korea at a place called Hensa, and they have this sort of annual festival where people come like in busloads, and it's where they've sort of preserved 1,000 years of wood blocks in the original Tripitaka Koreana texts in Chinese characters. And when I thought of salt, I was also thinking about whether salt in Christianity is linked to purity and permanence, so on and so forth, associations in various religions, in the case of Buddhism for warding off evil, but purely as an element of sustenance, one that extends life as a preservative, salt and its connections. But I was completely surprised, because when I took it to Korea, it was people there who couldn't speak the language, like couldn't talk to me. There was this language barrier because they only spoke Korean. And the first thing that struck them was that I was coming from India, and that their association with salt was really the Gandhi's salt. And I kept thinking about how a pinch of salt really brought down an empire, and in this case, it was almost like a pinch of salt trying to resist forgetting, and this kind of resistance towards forgetting, because I started then working around texts that were revoked and recreated in various sites. So then I started carrying this text outdoors, where I had people walk over it, and it would keep appearing in different places at different times. And what was so nice is that people just joined in to make the text which was not intended, and that's something that happens all the time, where your own intentions are changed because of public participation and intervention. It's really nice to see them. And the performative element of the making of the work, which and then I started taking these texts to the beach, where these are texts in salt, which, like I said, it's a kind of return to the sea, salt having come from the sea. And there is a relationship between the salinity levels of the body and those of the seas, having come from the Precambrian seas. And I was really interested in how these would manifest and then disappear in a few moments after the tide sort of takes it back. And that sort of evidence of this text would be lost in a few hours from the time these are made. So I've done a series of different texts over time now, some of them for particular exhibitions, and some of them are translations in various language scripts. And now, more recently, I've been working with women poets who've written in regional Indian languages translated into English. So these are some of the more recent works, and one last one which I will show you, which is a text that I wrote more recently. But this is an ongoing project on the beach. And there is that element of surrender where you're collaborating with the natural forces of nature. So while we might make these, human sort of apparatuses, human apparatuses, and yet here you are sort of working with tidy calendars and sunset timing. This is a piece that was first conceived in 2011 when I was invited to be part of the International Vinyl in Sweden, and that was called Art of the Time. Art of the Time of Creativity Fever. It's called Pandemonium. It was a project curated by Sarat Maharaj, who's a leading curator, and he was looking at Gothenburg, where the vinyl was held. This is in Vancouver, but where the original project took place was a vinyl that was in Gothenburg, and Gothenburg was one of the first places in Europe to look for a new model for trying to humanize labor post-industrialization, when there was a sort of assembly line factory model of working, and they were sort of experimenting, like the Volvo factory experiment was one of the experiments that they were trying to see how they could come up with a new model. And these were some of the histories of that site that I was trying to think about. And of course the trade between India and Sweden, and how one could use yarn, and yet yarn is something that is so widely used in. So I kept thinking of what else could be treated like yarn, and I eventually decided to work with electric cable, treating it like embroidery almost, and the electric cable as something that is of course a transmitter of energies and ideas, and as communication cable in this sort of fiber optically connected world where so this sort of traces the movement of migrants historically from one point to the other, like tracing from indenture labor onwards, and this was iteration at in Vancouver, because Vancouver is a migrant city, and this was by the museum there, Vancouver Art Gallery, who has this outdoor site, and I thought it was a beautiful site because it had this water body over which the piece is reflected, and it has a strong sound element where there are sounds of high voltage electric current, drowned with which are factory sirens, ship horns, communication tones, deep sea drone sounds, and it's really the sound that draws you in even across the street, and then people would just come and walk along this pathway that was created on water. So this was a piece that stayed on for many, many months, and in fact very recently, a few days ago, I met the curator in Delhi, and she was telling me of how the city has really embraced the project, and I was thinking, we don't really have that much of an opportunity in our own cities to engage the masses. So while art remains pretty much within private circles, to have this really shared at that scale, coming from a city of 7 million, 20 million, and we don't really have that. So this is how it's made in my studio, part by part, where it's a very labor-intensive process, and sometimes it takes you just a day to make just 2 or 3 lines, because you're actually entwining this wire around, say, nails, and then knotting, and the second line around it, looping the wire as you go along. And coming to the last project that very recently was brought down, was shown at Kemol Prescott Road in Bombay in October. This is what sort of leads you into the gallery itself from across the street, where I wanted to sort of make this encounter beginning from the street, where it's a text that forms this kind of a zebra crossing that says, do you hear what I say, do I speak what you hear? And this kind of gaps in transmission between what is said and what is understood. So the show really is about the space of interpretation, and how and these gaps where the hyphen is really used as something that is used to join or paste these differences together. And so as you come up, you have another video which is playing outside that has birds flying across cables, and it forms a text with birds going and seating themselves on these cables, and it just says, on the horizon the shadow speaks another story, again underlining the fact that there is another view out there. So the show really is a series of reflections on our own limited understanding of the whole as a fraction or a part of the whole that we all hold on to. And again, through several works, this is a video which actually has 14 people at an optometrist clinic getting their eyes tested, almost like a health check of the nation, with each person reading one alphabet at a time. But what they are reading is actually a fragmented recital from the preamble of the Constitution of India. So they are just reading one alphabet at a time. And this constant change of lenses between the doctor constantly prodding for clarity through a hazy vision is somewhere where I think the meaning of the work lies, because it's our own lenses that we filter information through, how we process what comes to us, what we make of it, and so on. I mean, we all know that our understanding is a complex set of interactions between seeing, remembering, perceiving, some shaped by language, some by imagery. And while we think of these faculties as separate, they all come into play, some element, a fictional element of the imagination too, which we often don't seem to take into account. And so this is an earlier work from 2011, but I just thought it sort of set the key to the rest of the exhibition, because this piece called White Birds, it's simply titled White Bird, but has a painting which has a pigeon that carried a number, and this is within this year that this one pigeon that flew into India was treated like a spy pigeon. Many of you may have read stories about how it was being scrutinized and created a lot of paranoia about this suspicious looking pigeon, which is again, you can look at the symbolism as a white bird, as peace-loving dove, or so on. But here, that on the one hand, and on the other, you had this drone that had flown into Pakistan that was shot down by the authorities there, suspecting that it was sent as a spy drone from India. And the two stories that accompany these. This was a large body of work called Hyphenated Lives, which has sort of imagined species of animals, birds, trees that are based on countries that are politically partitioned, but like I said, continue to sort of share their natural resources, and how often these themselves, when national symbols are meant to unite people from a particular region, then often become points of contestation and conflict, where countries then try to claim ownership over these. And I was reading about how the Israelis had raised objection to the Palestinian sunbird because of the name Palestine being part of the bird's identity, and it was part of stamps, like postage stamps in Israel, and how I just thought it's, how annoying to think that they're trying to change the name of this bird. And I made this bird, which is actually one half coming from the cuckoo, the Israeli national bird, and the other half from the Palestinian sunbird. So these sort of form these hybrids of whether it's from Ireland, UK, North Korea, South Korea, from Palestine, Israel, of course, and then US and Cuba, US, Mexico, Macedonia and Serbia, and Austria and Hungary. So this again entailed a lot of research, because nearly 2 years of studying material, and in this case, because it was treated like a natural history museum, where it's almost like looking at found material, has evidence perhaps from the past, or a proposition for the future. There were like almost like bone fragments of animals that had one part coming from one national bird and the other in the other national. And yet the usage of the wire, the electric cable as electric motive throughout these, where it sort of again holds these inherent contradictions between one that's an enabler, conduit, carrier, and yet here morphs into dark wires. So these rivers that were again meant to be shared are partitioned, and all of these are actually two different birds coming together, or two different animals coming together, and how the mind really completes the gaps. So these sort of drawing the dots that. So this is the magar, and the magar being from Pakistan, and the cobra from India. So there were like coins and stamps, postage stamps, all of these sort of created things. Or this is the cuckoo bird and the Palestinian sunbird, the combination of the two of them. Where of course I was sort of alluding to the relationship being critically endangered. Crested Karakara and the eagles, Karabal. So the names are all coined as well. So there's PL, the Doyal from Bangladesh, and the peacock from India. And the Doyal is actually a very, very small bird. So. And there were other things which were, other works which had, this again has kind of like an embroidery ring, and has one half of the lung growing, one half grows into the banyan and the other into the deodar tree. It's called half oxygen. This has the sound of the river and sound of the heartbeat. Whereas Anatomy of Distance, the one on the left, forms a kind of spinal column, but it's actually the line of control here. You see that makes a really strong buzz sound as you go up close. So they all are, they have sensor devices that activate with the human presence. And in this case, it's the light that lights up the roots. So these are all fairly large. And now we come to this last room, which had these red and blue lines, which I don't know, many of you may have used it as an introduction to writing, and our own kind of indoctrination into this sort of unwritten piece of paper maybe, which again has these shadows that exist, perhaps prejudices we bring to an empty sheet of paper that morph and wires seem to have gone already or with the lines forming shadows, silhouettes. Some of them are based on Venn diagrams. And this is a video called Pause, Persist, which again has a lot of, it's a play with the self and its own sort of dualities within the self that again could be something that is between people, but like with the text that I had outside, many of these contradictions are something that could lie within the self that then get externalized. And absolutely last two works for those of you who are not So this is again in Salt. And these are dates of independence wars having gone down in history, where one was really thinking about our own ideas of independence and interdependence. I think at such a point in time where one is having to look at a species other than the human race to find answers to problems that perhaps exist today. And I think in the more recent work there is much more of a looking back at natural forms, at so I'm thinking of these of course as dates of wars, but what I'm trying to say is that the last work that I did with the species was in a way trying to look at how certain species which are native to a particular land, you know that the existence of one depends on the existence of another, and the disappearance of one leads to the disappearance of another. And just looking at how these relationships that are so fraught between people have to be really considered and yeah, this is absolutely nice.
So what you showed there, the wall, that's when you exhibit, that's up there as well, you know, go back,
Sorry.
This,
No, so these are just the these.
this is just your data, but it's
This
not
is-
up at the exhibition.
No, it's not at the exhibition site. Because there's always a big discussion about how much of the research material you put out, and whether as visual art, how much of it needs to be substantiated by having material that goes into the making made available. I mean, that's the backstory. Not everything necessarily is present. It exists in another form. Suppose the dates are there, but I think sometimes it becomes important to share what material goes into the making, because people often miss what those dates meant or what they were. And like this is the text, the same text which I have written. This forms the kind of horizon line. And like I said, these could be conversations that perhaps happen within the self, between two people, neighbors perhaps, or between two countries, and really looking beyond ideas of nationhood as I think I'll leave you with that. I've already spoken enough. So any questions, observations?
There's a question.
So, what's the most audacious project you've thought of but couldn't complete? What's the biggest, like in terms of scale, the biggest project you wanted to do but couldn't complete?
Not scale, but I think there are many works that always remain in the notepad and don't really get realized. And many of them are challenging, many of them don't find the right context. So it's also, while there is one practice that is very sort of individual, something that you are engaged with, a lot of times works are conceived depending on the particular site, context, conditions. So between all of these, there are many works that remain unrealized. As far as scale is concerned, I think the one at Bhavraji Art Museum was the biggest that got made. Very early there were pieces that I had proposed that there was no funding for. We all come from very modest backgrounds, and back then one couldn't even think of traveling or taking on a project if you would just send a simple invitation without having the support. And this brings us to what we were initially talking about, of how little we have in terms of support for the arts in this country, where there is no governmental support. There's countries that come with like full funding for the artists who can apply to funding agencies. There is absolutely none of that for young artists who begin to start making work. And some of us were fortunate that very early work began being recognized, and we got exhibitions, like our launch exhibitions, mine soon after art school, and had galleries that not supported the work in terms of the making, but at least consistently showing the work, which meant that you at least continued to make work. Whereas many of young artists' works just die out because they simply have no platform to even share their work, leave alone having any support to make work. So a lot of works that just remain in notepads. Someday one can do a whole project on
The notepad work.
on the unrealized projects.
I have two questions actually. One is a technical one. So you use these wood stencils so that you can reproduce them again somewhere?
Well, these, that's interesting because the process of making these works is very, you're sort of relying on situations, and I have to go back to the sea a few times. It's not as though, and sometimes it's completely effortless. So there may be months of recreating a text that just hasn't been captured. So when I first started working on the beach, it was in the evenings with almost like a performance with so many people surrounding, and you really had to try to make space for yourself. And I realized that there was no way I could write peacefully. And then I decided I have to make stencils, so at least I can just lay the salt. And also the salt doesn't flow easily when you're at the beach. So you might make different tools while you're in the studio which work, but the moment you get to the sea, the humidity levels there are completely something else, as against that in the studio. So none of those tools meant that the salt flowed easily. And then often the tide either just comes in and sweeps the text in a fraction of a second, and you can't even capture it. So sometimes you spend a few hours just making it, and then it's just too soon that it comes and goes. And other times I've experienced making my text, and funnily the tide is coming in and swept one half of the beach and the other, and this part just remains untouched. And it starts to go back. So I really have to, now I've found an accurate tidal calendar that I can follow, and I sort of note the dates that I will be at the beach and the time, and know exactly when to deposit the text and when it will be. So now I've been able to find my method.
So this huge stencil also becomes a piece of film.
Yeah, it becomes also, it's much more legible, I think, the text, if I just were to write, which is what I really intended to do initially. Because a lot of these, I only saw myself as a catalyst where people would send me texts that they had written that I would recreate, and it wasn't as though I was necessarily writing the text.
But you would relate?
Sometimes, in one case it was quite unnerving because I hadn't expected a mother who had actually lost her son, who was 21 years of age in a car accident, and 3 years ago, sent me this direct letter to her son. And it was really like talking to him and having a whole conversation about how she speaks to him, and that was quite emotionally sort of, a lot of.
You use that in your work?
That was for a particular work where I was invited. It was by this organization called Art Oxygen that really works outdoor, and I've begun to work with them on several projects where, like we said, there is no infrastructure for the arts, and I made, and many times you set out to do an exhibition outdoor, and little do you realize that you spend 3 months not just making the work, taking it, manning it, having your own people replenish what is to be kept during the duration of the exhibition. So there are so many things that need to be looked after, maintained, cared for, that you need assistance and help for. So having collaborators who will look after that aspect of showing and sharing the work, becomes that much possible to work around.
My second question is regarding the India-Pakistan works you've done. Are you from Punjab, and did you have some memories because they appear?
Yeah, well, I grew up listening to stories from my father about he was born in Lahore, he moved to Punjab in India, and then his brothers moved post-partition. Little did I know it would have any bearing on my practice back then, because I think it was much more the work that I began seeing in the early 90s, that time when you're most impressionable, and a lot of artists whose works I've really admired, and whether it was Amar Kanwar, Nalini Manani, and I mean, I think also our own understanding, like I said initially, of how we experience the city has also changed over the years. I think when we grew up, it was this feeling that we all live in a very, very secular environment. We have always grown up with many communities around us. And I think even my move to Bandra from another suburb meant that I was constantly bumping into people who would speak about how our societies are clean, and about certain communities not being. And it struck me how deep-rooted these fissures have grown in, and how educated people can still speak about these kind of discriminations against communities, and how pervasive it is.
I make them judgments. I mean, if you notice the difference between judgment and difference.
It's kind of them and us, and so I think, a lot of that has also fed into the work. But yeah, I do have very sort of strong memories, not just of my dad's brother took the train back to Pakistan to retrieve things that he had left behind, simply because he didn't want any misunderstandings in the family, of jewels that remained in the bank lockers, and he took that journey back. And so, all of those stories, I think a lot of us have known, but also my experience of flying over the line of control in 2001 was something that really stayed with me for a long time, almost like an incision on the landscape when the pilot announced that those of you who would like to see this border across Pakistan. It just felt like a wound, in a landscape, and as far as your vision could go. That I've just shown you a cross-section of the work, but there's several other works that weave around this.
Any questions? I have a question that I was looking through while you were showing us stuff, because there's so much reflection on concept, on history, and on material in the story that you're telling us. And this is, I don't know, it's always an awkward question to ask, right? Because when you find the exhibit is the work that is there. And sometimes when I go into, when I see our work, I often wish for a little bit of something that would sort of, for me, I see seeing something like this takes you on your own reflective journey, right? You see, but there's so much, like when you see a Van Gogh, it's easier because it's a passionate painting, and then it's a feeling at that level, and then you just receive it at that level. But when you see works which have been fed by so much thought and concept, I sometimes wish there was something that would allow that reflective journey to connect. And I don't know, I don't want to think about that.
Yeah, the mechanisms of what to, how much and how far you go with leading that process. And I'm not sure how necessary that process is even, because...
So I'll tell you what it's coming from, at the end of the second. So my parents, for instance, they're not people who've grown up, like I've went this journey in the last 10, 12 years, where a door open, window open, and I can walk in and I can walk in. But can you give her the mic?
Yeah, I think it's.
Yeah, sorry. I'm saying, for me, like I just feel that when you're watching an art, like something like the Vincent van Gogh, which is painted. First of all, painting is something we understand. We are told artist painting in school, right? So I don't know how it is now, but when we were kids, art was painting, so you're already open to that in a sense. And then you see something like the Van Gogh, where it's recognizable landscapes, even though it's abstract. I mean, it's impressionist and it's painted with, it's coming from a gut, and so you can receive it from a gut. But now I see a lot of this work which is there's so much conceptual thinking in the work. And it's lovely to hear about it because there's concept in thought, there's a engagement with history and the way things are now, and then there is even thinking about material. It's not just, it's not that you take any material and make it. And I'm asking you the question specifically about how can the viewer, what is the connect? Is it enough just to put it there, or is there something real? Because recently my parents went to an art exhibition, and there are people who are quite open, but they don't have this is not practice. It's not like about where you have a museum and you walk and you keep going and it becomes practice. So for somebody who's not practice but is open, they don't know how to enter. I don't know how else to put it. And then how does that entry, you're absolutely right, you don't want to give away the backstory, but how can the entry happen in a way that people can then dive in, is the question that I...
No, this is a general, I think even as artists, when we go to all over the world, whether it's you look at several biennials, you don't really have easy access to the intentions unless you have some sort of leads given in. And I have chosen to do that, to sometimes give a little short text. So even in my last exhibition, there were short texts. They were not really in your face, but if you wanted to and that you were interested in sort of understanding what the original intentions are, because you may draw your own conclusions, and that's really the intention ultimately, that you would like to leave it open to interpretation and not necessarily slap your own interpretation and leave it closed to that. But I am of the opinion that you need to provide some leads, some sort of an entry point, and I myself feel the need for that when I go to see so many works across the world of other artists who are not only not aware of their backgrounds, their histories, not just their personal histories, but cultural histories. There's just so much that you need to, or you would like to know that, but this has always been a point of great debate. We in the art world have always discussed this, and how there's also huge criticism for those who put up a text. So,
That's always been there.
And 2008, when I showed, it was like, so while you have good reviews, you have counterpoints, which is good, it's healthy. And then it would be like, but do you really need to put up a text? Is your work not sufficiently
about what you want to really...
Can it not just speak for itself? And I feel that it's not meant to close interpretation, but I just feel that I would like to share a little more to deepen that engagement, and that's a personal choice. I know those who are completely averse to it, and they choose never to have that, but I think it's also the nature of the work. In some cases, you don't feel the need to accompany it with a text, but in other cases, you feel that, I think if I had the species without even mentioning that they are particularly from countries that are partitioned and which are those countries, you would lose the whole plot. I think, so it depends on the nature of the work. It may not hold true in every case.
But sometimes it also, I'm agreeing to what you're saying, but sometimes it also stops your imagination, It's like I've seen some of the work, I'm not into art so much, but whatever little I've seen, I've always felt that, whenever I read a text next to the painting, my whole imagination stopped. Because I was thinking of that, and I was trying to imagine, and probably it also, one painting can open several different gates for somebody who's a newcomer or who's getting into it. And when I read the text, or even if the name, if the painter has named it, then also it's like, if you get into a mode and on a path. Like there's this painting, it's said laborers were going on the work for work. It's by a very famous painter. I got that thing from somewhere, and I was perceiving it in a very different way. The moment I read the name below, it sort of stopped me from my own interpretation. So then, what you're saying, that this argument is,
But I think it's fine that that's precisely the point, that it's not to say that you are wrong or right, because I don't think, this is material produced. I don't even feel that I may have my own intentions at arriving at, or my own journey arriving at peace, but I think it has to go beyond this time. And I'm not going to be the one dictating what this means or what this holds. And so it's really material that is open to interpretation, has to hold the test of time, and there will be several art historians who might interpret this material at different times, different ways. So of a number of artists who in their lifetimes are either not acknowledged or looked over, and then they get rediscovered over time. So who is to really judge what is, I can't hold a flag for it and say that this is what it is, but I can only put forth what the original intentions of doing this work. Then of course the work goes beyond that. It has to.
I have one more question. So because I was looking at this, you were talking about your thought, like the maps, right? And you were talking about electric cables and how you thought the soundscapes. And I was wondering to myself that when you have so much concept and thought behind it, how does that make the final aesthetic that you? Because some of the viewer is going to enter on that.
I think that's in fact the real struggle, because many a times you have very interesting material, but you don't know how you're going to present it, and that remains such a challenge over time that you feel that the form and content haven't come together in a way that changes experience, and you might sit with a lot of archival material, research material, and I just feel that doesn't make good art necessarily, and unless I'm able to arrive at, and many a times it's just the struggle, and you just feel that it's not resolved, and you have to abandon it at some point, and you get quite possessive about the material you worked with for about say 2 years, but you have to be able to distance yourself and say that I don't think it yet has anything to offer to the viewer in terms of an experience. Not to say that everything one makes ultimately does, but you at least make that attempt to arrive at something that will work at various levels. Perhaps there may be the intellectual processes, but also the physicality of the material you're working with, and the aesthetic processes, and all of those have to come together. Emotional processes in some cases. So that is really the key, where you're not always sure about how you find. So you can encode the sculpture with a lot of material. How does the viewer decode that information? So you have to work both ways, as not just somebody who makes, but who then accesses this and receives this. And that, I think, is something that you learn much, much more from your viewers, from the audience, which is why I think that really is the enriching process of once you share your work and how people, because a lot of work, if I have to go back and tell you about a lot of the work, people have come and seen something like where I've Chris Travis controlled the photo piece with the bats. I showed that in Helsinki, I think in Finland, in Sweden, and traveled to places, and people would come and see the whale form, and I was completely struck because I hadn't even seen the whale, but that is the negative space between the backs where the arms kind of link up, and this black form is what people saw before they saw the backs. And then somebody said it's like the woman facing darkness, and all kinds of interpretations that you hadn't thought about. And I think that's really when people start telling you about your work is really when you feel that the work has been able to strike a chord and that you're learning about it.
Sounds more like your statement. Do I hear what you say? It's more identical to that.
That's right.
I have a question regarding this. I don't need the mic. So, when you say you have to work both ways, right? So when you have a thought or probably what you want to say in your work, so are you also thinking and changing your work by looking at the other side and how the viewer is going to perceive it? Or is it just like, I just want to say this, however the viewer perceives it? Or is it more like, I didn't get when you're working both ways?
Like, what I mean by that is that, of course, it remains a personal process to begin with. So, you're not tailoring your work to your viewer, because I don't even know my viewer. I mean, given where the work travels, where it gets shown, you don't know your audience necessarily, unless it is for a specific project. But what I mean by that is that it's one thing to think of material, find a language for that material, but you also know that as a receiver, if I'm going to put down these addresses, and that has to be the key to unlock this work. I mean, what is it? How will I provide something to the viewer to then work backwards and try and understand where all of these addresses come from? Or, I mean, in cases where I've done pieces where I've worked around the inlay patterns from, say, the Taj and other monument sites, where archaeologists had discovered while they were replacing stones that lead you to the Taj and other monument sites, that there were inscriptions on the ground made perhaps by masons. So they believed that these were mason marks. So much is known about the architects and the calligraphers, but very little known about the masons who actually were involved in the building of these Mughal monuments. And while I started researching and photographing these, I went to several sites, not just in Agra, say, Madhugala, Fatehpur Sikri, Sikandra, going all the way to Qutub in Delhi, because they believe that the same families moved from one location to the other, and perhaps these were ways of being remunerated for parts that they had laid down, that they would leave a mason mark. But to me it was interesting to layer these inlay patterns with another layer of history, of labor, of so while I was making these stamps from those symbols, because many of them are like arrows and lotus forms and all of these like little drawing doodles, scribbles, those then were made into rubber stamps. And of course, like the stamp, that was what it began with, like being part of the bureaucratic apparatus. I was thinking of like the symbol of authority that endorses something, that is a confirmation of something that exists, that's found, and that became a language. So it wasn't as though, it's not a pre-existing language, it was always people I work with who make rubber stamps. I've begun to see it's a big industry now. When I tell them a few hundred pieces, they're like, that's it. You know, I say, you make one stamp, one name stamp. I give you a few hundred, you say this is because I've worked with so many names and inscriptions. But what I'm really saying is that it became became a language that then over time I felt that I didn't have to necessarily talk about what that bureaucratic apparatus means in terms of being a stumbling block, being something that we as a nation are so deeply entrenched in a bureaucracy. And that became a metaphor so a lot of the symbols are like the mediums, for instance, the wire and this kind of morphing of the wire. So it's really like taking a single wire, then entwining 3 wires to make barbed wire. It's like, again, manufacturing it, and it completely changes meaning. So for me, it sort of holds both these ideas together, and then that becomes a motif that then runs through different works. So it becomes a language that then takes different forms in different works.
They want to hear your question.
Yeah. Why he stress on authorities?
They can't hear your question.
Why he stress on authority in your work? I mean, what's the origin?
So like when I started, I was talking about how the kind of inclusions and exclusions, because this whole debate about the outsider in the city began with North Indians who in 2003, these were very much part of our thinking of people who've come in and how they've taken on job opportunities, and the status of the migrant as somebody who's unrecognized, doesn't necessarily have, is not somebody who can vote, has voting rights and so on. So really it began with that, of looking at those who were excluded in the margins, but then through that, like I said, when I started working with the first few pieces, I started seeing that there was a potential of looking at other archives, other material that's not been brought to the limelight. I mean, not to say that by my doing so that it does anything. I mean, it's not an activist gesture, but it is sort of bringing to surface something that exists and then looking at that material as something you're reflecting upon. And so it was actually pretty much by chance. I think some of the accidents that happen are much more interesting than those that you very deliberately try to make happen. Sometimes I feel like the first gestures are the most, are strongest in a way. Of course, sometimes they evolve, but other times you feel like, are you just pushing the point and it's not really contributing anything more. But you're constantly testing yourself as an artist. You're not sure about whether this works. Sometimes over a period of time when you look back and you see that some things were more meaningful than others, some things fade down. But the stamp really as something that stamps out things that don't mean much. It becomes a kind of palimpsest you can keep adding to. And like I said, with the names, that whole thing of renaming, of adding another layer of history to a pre-existing history of the city. So as a device that became all of that. There is an element of clay, there is some things that you're trying to draw attention to. As an artist, you're also working, like I said, with different languages, so you try to weave these stories together, not necessarily all in very successful ways.
And not necessarily to make a particular statement. Thank you. We're coming to the end of this. Thank you so very much, Srina, for this lovely session.
Thank you.